Hello everyone, thank you for joining this webinar. Today we're going to be looking at the strategies and tips for becoming a Certified Information Systems Security Professional, also known as the CISSP. Now, before we get underway with this webinar, I just want to make a couple of points. Firstly, if you have any questions, then you can use the chat window on the webinar to submit any questions you may have. And then towards the end of this webinar, we're hopefully going to answer as many of those as possible. And also, this webinar is being recorded, so soon, shortly afterwards, you'll receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar. Okay, let's move on. So, quick introduction. My name is Stuart Scott, and I'm the AWS Content Lead here at Cloud Academy, and I focus on all things AWS. But I also have an interest in security as well. And I'd like to introduce Ross Leo, who is the Chief Information Security Officer at ObserveSmart InvisiAlert Solutions. And Ross is an information security professional. He's been in the industry for over 36 years. He's worked internationally as a security and privacy consultant. He's worked for NASA for 22 years, where he's held some high positions such as the Director of Security Engineering and Chief Security Architect for Mission Control. He also joined CISSP as a chairman of the Curriculum Development Committee, and he's an CISSP certified instructor, where he has trained and certified over 9,500 CISSPs. So we're in great company today. So welcome to the webinar, Ross.
Thank you, Stuart.
Okay, let's take a
look
at
be here. Very, very glad to be here.
Yeah, great to have you on board. So looking through the agenda for today, we're going to answer the question, who is the CISSP certification designed for? So we're going to look at the different types of roles that are involved for people taking the CISSP. We're then going to look at some of the prerequisites, and with many certifications out there today, there's always a list of prerequisites that you need to meet before attaining the certification. So we're going to run through those as well. We're then going to spend a bit of time looking at the exam information itself. So we're going to look at the question format, things to prepare for on the day, and just some exam tips as well, just so you're familiar with what to expect on the actual exam day itself. And then we're going to get into some of the meat of the CISSP itself. So we're going to look at the different domains involved. And there's 8 different domains, as you can see. So we're going to dive into each of those, and Ross is going to talk to us about some of the key points and areas to look out for within each of those domains. So we'll come on to those as well. And then towards the end, we've actually prepared a learning path here at Cloud Academy to help you prepare for this difficult certification. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that towards the end. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A session. So like I said before, if you have any questions throughout this webinar, please do submit them, and we'll try and answer as many as we can as we go through. So let's get started. So who is the CISSP designed for? As you can see, there's a list of roles on screen there. But I just want to ask you a question, Ross. In your experience, what sort of roles have candidates that you've taught have you seen? And do you see more than one particular role over the other?
Well, that's an excellent question. The thing that I most commonly come across is people with a network security background or a network administrator's background. And the roles that are listed really do represent the vast majority of the attendees and the classes I've held in the past. A couple of roles that don't appear here really are very much in the minority, but in recent years, I've had more developers attending because with the development of the DevSecOps approach, there's more interest in developers. They typically don't like security because security tells developers, no, you can't do that. It's not secure quite often. But I've also found that lawyers have begun to attend because, as we all know, there is a lot of legal impact in security programs, security privacy. But these really do represent the vast majority of the backgrounds of the people that do attend. A lot of people that are moving into a CISO role, for example, are beginning to attend more often. But this really does represent a lot of the background.
It's interesting to see that there's other areas and additional roles kind of moving into this area. I think it kind of shows that security is kind of really being adopted by the wider community and all kind of areas and departments, which is really good to see.
Well, to on the tail of your comment, those of us who have been in this profession a very long time have always maintained security is a business issue. And I think the evolution that you mentioned is very much the indicator that the businesses really begin to believe that. So it's good that it's infiltrating, so to speak, the rest of the
Definitely,
business in a way that can bring this kind of rationality to it.
definitely, it's definitely an important point to make, certainly. So as we move on to the prerequisites of becoming a CISSP, there's a number of prerequisites here. So you have to have a certain amount of experience, 5 years full-time paid work, or supplement that with 4 years and a particular certification or college degree as listed on the screen. But you can also still take this exam if you don't hold the full list of prerequisites. And if you take the exam and pass it, you become an associate of ISC squared. Now, Ross, do you see many candidates that are taking this certification without having the full list of prereqs, and then they hope to kind of meet those prerequisites afterwards to then attain the full certification?
Well, let me answer this in two ways. First off, you're exactly right. There is a way to take the exam now, get it out of the way, so to speak, because the people who have to take that route have been put in a position where security is perhaps going to become a part of what they do more so in the future than it does today. And they're going to be building their experience. And I do see an increased number of people doing that. Back in the earlier days, in the 90s, when many people started out and the security and the certification was new, a lot of us had many years, decade or more worth of experience. Today's world, we don't have the luxury of having a lot of people develop that kind of experience and then get into it and take this. So they are starting earlier. And this has proven to be a very beneficial thing because starting earlier means they're able to infiltrate the security in a much more natural way. So yes, I do see an increase in people who do that. Now the process, and this is a point that people who are in that position need to know, the process works like this. You don't have the experience. You tell ISC squared what you do have, and they will tell you, okay, it's not quite there, but you can go ahead and take the exam, become the associate of ISC squared, as you've mentioned, and then they give you a process by which you accumulate and report your security experience so that when you do cross over that 5-year mark in whatever combination you have, you automatically become the CISSP. There's no retaking of the exam when you get to that point. So this is a good way to work your way up to that level.
So there's no to make it easier. Would you say it's easier to have the list of prerequisites first, or does it not make too much of a difference? It's more your kind of real world experience before you gain that full certification.
I don't think it makes a lot of difference. The exam is
Okay.
going to be the same regardless, but I don't think that there's a lot of difference. It's just a question of where are you in the spectrum of the experience on that timeline.
Okay, that makes sense. Excellent, thank you. So if we move on to the exam information itself, we have some information here on the format, how to register, the exam date, and some advice. If I could pass this over to you, Ross, just to kind of give us your thoughts on the exam format. I mean, I can see there that it says the candidate will face a minimum of 100 and a maximum of 150. Can you kind of explain why we have those two values?
Yes, this I will tell you starting out is one of the areas that most candidates that I have in my classroom, this is what they're most nervous about. This is what they really want because this helps them prepare for the actual, you could call it a battlefield experience. The move from a static 250 question 6-hour exam to the adaptive form that it's in now is a simple recognition that testing processes evolve. So this has gotten to be more in line with modern testing techniques. As such, the 100 minimum is the baseline that people get. And what I hear from most test-taking candidates, this of course comes after class and they've taken it, is they seem to be seeing around 120 on average. Now, they count those. They get nervous if they get close to 150, but no one seems to be getting the 100. So I would expect that a candidate should see probably in the neighborhood of, say, 120 or so, but not to get worried if it goes a little bit beyond that. The biggest change that this exam format brings out is the fact that each question is presented one time only. The way an adaptive test works, and this, forgive me if I take up a little bit too much time, but this helps the candidates understand why it is the way it is.
Sure.
With every answer on every question, and I want to highlight the fact that they need to answer every single question, it still records only correctly answered questions as far as the score calculation is concerned. Questions left blank, questions given no answer, questions answered wrong don't count. Only correct answers do. And that has a lot to do with how many questions a candidate will see. But because it's an adaptive test, every answer contributes to the adaptation that the test engine will go through for whatever the following questions will be. So it is even more critical that you answer each question. But if you were to go back and be able to review a question, that would change the adaptive path. So each question will be presented only one time.
So
and they will be in different format.
Sorry, Ross. So there's no way to mark a question and then revisit it at the end of the exam. It's just see it once, answer it, move on, and that's it.
That's right. And what that does though, is it makes it even more necessary that the candidate consider their answer very carefully. They have 3 hours to take the exam, which will still be sufficient time. Most candidates don't run up against the boundary. But it does mean you have to consider even more carefully the answer that you're going to give, because it will affect what you will see as it will the score that you get. So, and the questions will be in a variety of forms. But there typically is only a single answer that is correct, as it's always been.
Excellent.
So, that's really about all the insight I can give them on the actual exam. Everyone should understand that everybody's question collection that they'll see will be different than anyone else's. And that's because the test engine selects at random the questions that each candidate will see.
And at the end of the exam, is there a percentage, or is it just simply you've passed or you failed?
The minimum passing score line that you see is 70%. Now, that means that when the test engine has registered that you've achieved that level, and that given the pattern of answering that you've done, that's a stable 70%, it is basically going to simply stop. If you've answered 121 questions and gotten to that particular point, then the test engine just stops the exam.
Okay.
And now, just to make sure we cover both ends, if you get to question 150, it's going to stop. But what that will do is that will then calculate the score, and the candidate will know how they did in the pass-fail mode when they leave the test center, because they will get a printout that says either, this is unfortunate, I don't know the exact wording, of course, but it will say that you have provisionally passed, or it will give you some sort of a conciliatory letter if the candidate hasn't. And if they don't, it will give them a score and a breakdown by ranking of the domains and how they did with respect to the overall exam.
Okay.
But if they pass, they will not be told their score. All they can say with certainty is that they met the minimum. And that's really all any of us can ever say. I took my exam in 1997. I still have no idea what I actually scored. So, but my point is, people do worry about that, and don't worry about the score. If you passed the minimum, you passed.
Excellent. Simple as that. Nice and easy, eh?
It really is. It really is. It's not something to be overly concerned with. Do the very best you can, and if you get your pass, you're good.
Excellent. Okay, let's now move on to the different domains. Like I said, there's 8 domains in total. The first domain is security and risk management. Now, on the screen, there's a list of different areas of focus within this particular domain. Ross, would you say there's certain elements within security and risk management that you should focus on more than the others? Or do you have any kind of do's and don'ts within this domain?
Well, I do, and this is something that can help a candidate tailor their study habits. Obviously, every candidate should study areas more diligently where they feel weak, but still give attention to areas where they're strong. Domain 1 tends to bring out the fact that the CISSP, each domain is a combination of soft skill and hard skill. So understanding concepts, and in this one in particular, understanding the concepts of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, knowing what elements make up risk. There's even a bit of math that might be possible in this particular one, because in a very simple math, but having to calculate the single loss expectancy and so on, those are both conceptual and a little bit of a harder skill that they need to know. Here, knowing regulatory issues, knowing the essence of them, knowing the concepts of risk and so on, that's really what this kind of domain would be about. But a candidate should bear in mind that understanding that and doing well in this domain will be very much a part of doing well in the others, because they're based on it. That is, they're based on security and risk management from that perspective. So being very familiar with the concepts here and with what constitutes threats, that sort of thing, very definitely at the heart of this kind of domain.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Just one quick question that I have actually, and I'm sure this is probably going to be asked by someone else as well. Obviously, there's lots of standards and regulations and frameworks, all with long names and lots of numbers and digits after them. Do you have to
Yes.
do you have to know each of those individually inside out, or just kind of the core principles that they govern?
It really is more the latter, knowing the kind of principles rather than knowing each one individually. Many of the frameworks that you mentioned, such as the Sherwood one, the NIST risk management framework, the ISO series, the ISO 27000 series, knowing the fundamental structure of them in terms of principles and concepts would really be a much better way to approach this, because quite frankly, however they're constructed in their nuts and bolts, they're all based on the same basic principles. And this examination, though it may emphasize, to bring out a particular point, the NIST risk management framework perhaps more than others, and that really is pure conjecture on my part. I couldn't guarantee that that would be the case.
Sure.
But knowing the concepts, the foundational parameters of each of these frameworks, you'll find that there's a great deal of similarity between them, however their nut and bolt structure is. So that would really be the better approach than to try to know 27001 in great depth and not really have paid attention to any of these others.
That's good to know. Okay, so moving on to domain 2, asset security. There's a few areas of focus here, like not as many as the previous one, but I'm sure it's not any less important. Do you have any insight or points to discuss with regards to asset security?
In asset security, a lot of the structure here relates to who owns what, who does what is the motivation behind the sort of things that they're going to do. it emphasizes retention because there's usually a regulatory requirement associated with that. And to the point, sort of like what you were talking about with the frameworks, it's not knowing the time frames. It's knowing the basics of why you would retain a particular record. The time frame varies with the regulation, and you'd have to know each regulation. So that sort of thing isn't really important here. You would need to know that in your job because then it would be a requirement of the job based on the regulations you have to meet.
Okay.
Knowing what the basic security controls are, how they work together, and what they're actually protecting will be another very important aspect of this particular domain.
And when it's referring to asset security, is this physical assets or can it be virtual servers within the cloud? Could that be classed as an asset, or does it cover kind of both elements?
Actually, that's an extremely important point. I'm glad you brought that up. It will address the information asset. It will address, to a limited degree, the physical asset. The CISSP has always had physical security as a part of it, so there will be a bit of that. But it will also address virtual assets and the basic reasons, concepts, and other ideas about how you would protect each one, very much in context with what the asset actually is, such as a virtual server or a physical asset or a document. So understanding each of those types in context, again, at a more conceptual level than the actual nut and bolt, would indeed be important.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I was just curious if it was just purely physical or virtual, but it's both. So.
Oh, I know. Because of your Amazon focus, that prompts you to ask the question. But as I say, that is an extremely important point to bring out, and I'm very glad you did.
No, thank you for clarifying. Okay, so let's move on to domain 3, security architecture and engineering. So similar focus again, really. If you can just run through key points and elements to focus on, that'd be great, Ross.
Okay. Here, with security architecture and engineering, here's where a person taking this exam would need to know architecture details, how the architecture works. Where would you do in the part of building an architecture or adopting one? Where would you do certain things? Why would you do certain things? What's the effect? Understanding a life cycle, because every one of the architectures that are mentioned, and again, like the frameworks, this doesn't ask you details of a specific architecture, but more on the concept level. Understanding various kinds of capabilities in terms of how an architecture would interact with those. Now, it will talk about how you look at an architectural design to find vulnerabilities, and mobile and web will, of course, be fundamental parts of this. There is an increased amount of IoT sorts of subjects because, as we all know, IoT is more or less one of the hot topics in the news these days. But again, it will not be system or vendor specific. That's a point I should have made earlier. This test stays away from any vendor specific things. It doesn't bring out any specific regulations, such as the General Data Protection Regulation from the EU or from NIST regulations here. It brings out the general concept of these things, such that how does it affect cybersecurity? And of course, inevitably, it's going to talk about crypto. But again, it's about the structure. It's about why you do a lot of the things that you do in this area, rather than speaking to a specific architectural model.
I guess depending on your current role as well, some of these domains might appear easier or more logical than others. I mean, for example, with this domain here, security architecture, if you're a solutions architect, then a lot of this might already be embedded in your day-to-day role anyway. So, I mean, I know there's other domains such as communication network security. If you're a network engineer, then that particular domain might be easier to kind of understand. Do you kind of get that feedback sometimes from different candidates?
Yes, I do. There are people that come from strong network architecture, network security backgrounds that they have a complete grasp of. But in the context of this domain, that would only be one aspect, because you have not just the network, but you have the structure of the way the systems work. To use the cloud framework as a basis for this, you'd have to figure out how to do an architectural model in cloud, which is fundamentally different than it is if you have it all in-house. So yes, a person's background will make this much more readily graspable than perhaps they would find another one to be. There is one thing that I need to mention, though, specifically with regard to this domain. It's possible for a candidate, and this is something that I've experienced with candidates in class and in my own work, you can get very, very deep into these things. I'm going to use a specific example. Let's say that we use the Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture. That one is something that can fully involve a person because that's what their enterprise has adopted. For a person who is that deeply engrossed in a specific architecture, a domain like this might be something of a trap. And I mean this. It means that someone given to the Sherwood way of looking at the universe, they're going to think of this in terms of everything that Sherwood defines. Now, that would not be the best way of approaching this, because the domain, and this is true of them all, the domain is much more generic than that. It'll talk about concepts on a more generic level than anything specific to a particular framework or a particular compliance regulation. So again, it emphasizes the concept, not a specific vendor's approach, TOGAF, SABSA, ISO. The concepts that they have in them are embedded here, but it's not asking you about each one of those specifically. And that's something that a candidate really does need to keep in mind.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for that, Ross. Moving on to Domain 4, Communication Network Security. So a few points here. What can you advise us on this section?
Well, there's really not much to say again here, except that this is one of the, as I mentioned, there's hard and soft skill and knowledge throughout. This one is probably going to be much more of a concrete sort of thing. A lot of this stuff is people in the jobs really have learned the specifics of doing a specific thing. People that are Cisco engineers or Palo Alto engineers, they will see this particular domain through that particular lens. That is a risk to the candidate because, again, this domain is not about Cisco or Netgear or Palo Alto or Juniper or whatever your favorite might be.
So very similar to what you explained in Domain 3.
Exactly. So my caution is be careful to leave your Cisco colored glasses at home and think again more about these things in the generic sense. That, I think, is the best advice I could give someone, especially someone coming from this background when they think about this domain, because it's really not true that you can blow a single domain and still expect to do well in the test. That's taking a great risk to think of it that way. So by being more general here, you'll do yourself better on the exam overall.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ross. That's a great insight there for sure. So Domain 5, Identity and Access Management. This one
tends to fall into the same sort of thing that I was describing in the domain we just left. This is really going to seem like it's very much a nut and bolt sort of thing. In it, it'll talk about classic discretionary access control, and that's really what this is about, is access control. But it has expanded over the years to be more identity than protecting user IDs and passwords and that sort of thing. Those, well-worn lessons are very much part of this. But it has expanded into the identity as a service, third party, single sign-on, federation. Those topics will be addressed in this domain as well. So having a much more modern perception of what the whole idea of IAM is about will really serve someone better than to look at it in the more classic form, more historical form of logon IDs and passwords. Those things, as I say, will be there, but it really is a much more modern approach, and that's what a candidate really needs to focus on.
A lot more in depth with the technologies.
Probably tokenization, types 1, 2, and 3 authenticators. As I say, those things will all be in there, but thinking of it in the classic sense will rob a candidate of some potentially good answers that they can give, and they need to think more about, the softer, squishier sort, to put it in kind of the best way that I can, of identity management that this is, and of course the issues that go along with that. That would be very much a part of this one.
Excellent, thank you. So moving on to Domain 6, Security Assessment and Testing. What do we have for this domain?
This one is going to be, to a great degree, understanding the process of how this works. Threat modeling will be part of this. Perhaps not a heavy subject, but it will be mentioned. It'll talk a lot about why you do the testing that you do. It'll talk about the logic of building a testing program. Again, it's not vendor or, say, an ISO standard specific. There are several standards that both NIST and ISO have published on this subject. And having a familiarity with those and the logic behind them would be a help to this domain. But again, it's really going to be more about the process, why you do what you do, what you are trying to do. One of the things that I have encountered with some candidates in recent months is some of these things that they will present will seem counterintuitive. For example, what is the purpose of a test? Well, it's to learn something, of course, see how things are done. But it'll throw the counterintuitive curve at a candidate by saying a test that finds no error, and this is simply an example that I use in class to illustrate the point. A test that fails to find an error is a test that has failed. And everybody looks at me and says, well, what are you talking about? That means that everything's perfect. The reason I use this example is it highlights one of the potential flaws in our thinking. And I include myself in flawed thinking. We think that a test that returns no findings is a successful test. The fact is, that is a test that has failed because it didn't detect the very thing it was looking for. Now, that's, as I say, that seems counterintuitive, but it pulls us back from what we have historically come to think and puts us more in the mode of thinking along the scientific method, if you will, if you'll permit me to say that. Because we have to think about what we're really doing. We're trying to find the errors. A test that doesn't find an error may mean that we have tested in the wrong spot. We've tested in the wrong way. We're not looking for the right thing, and the test isn't aligned. And those kinds of concepts are very much embodied here. This one, because of that sort of thing, this one can be kind of tricky. So while it seems that I'm off the point, I'm very much on the point with the problems that I've experienced teaching this module in class with candidates, and a lot of gotchas that people have and told me they have experienced on the exam and in the practice questions that they've used. So this is one to be very careful of. It's not a trap. I want to answer. Well, I want to.
That point.
Well, it highlights the fact that you have to think through your problems very carefully. But it also brings out another point that I need to mention. These questions are not meant to trick you. These questions are trying to find out what you know. And they're asking you very specific questions to find out what you know. So it
Sure.
means that the candidate must read very carefully to ensure they understand exactly what's being asked. I just want to highlight that these questions are not tricky, not stupid, not traps. Many candidates have felt that in the past, and that's really not what they're about. So anyway,
Just take your time. You only see it once.
that's an extremely important point. You do only see it once, so you do need to think it through carefully and take your time with the question.
Definitely. Okay, we have two more domains. Domain 7 is security operations. I mean, there's a lot of points on this. If you can just highlight 2 or 3 main areas, that would be great, Ross, that you'd kind of
This is
focus on.
this one is fairly simply explained. This is how we do things day to day. This takes the concepts that we've talked about in the previous 6 and some from the one we're going to talk about after this. And it simply talks about how do you actualize, how do you operationalize what you know, what you've learned. So this is really about working through the processes that do the things that conceptually we've outlined before. Physical security is going to be represented a bit. The disaster recovery planning process will be represented a fair bit. Those kinds of things are here, but it's all about doing it day to day.
Okay, excellent. So hopefully people should have some kind of experience in some of those in one area or another, which would be helpful. But like you say, it can't be seen through a particular vendor's glasses, for example, more of the conceptual approach.
Well, this one, just to highlight the point, let's take the first one, understand and support investigations. The process at one employer may not be exactly what you would have at another employer, but it's about the process of how it's formed. And this would talk about the important points to be carried out and accomplished during an investigation process. So that would be the kind of thing that a candidate would want to be comfortable with. How do I actually do these things day to day? And that's really the focus of this one.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, the final domain, software development security.
The easiest thing for me to say about this is not a module that teaches you how to do secure coding. This too is about the process. And one of the things that it will talk about is, and this is a point that it has emphasized down the years from when this first started, how do we build in things from the beginning to make the end product more secure rather than bolting them on later? It'll talk about DevOps. It'll talk about DevSecOps. It'll talk a little bit about Agile Scrum, because it's not about programming. It's about how we build a process to incorporate security from concept through delivery.
Okay.
So that's really going to be the focus of this one.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I mean, there's a lot of information there through those 8 domains, and it's going to be an awful lot of work for study for this certification. And some people might think, is it worth it? Some people see certifications as just a piece of paper. What do you kind of have to say to that approach?
Well, as having been a hiring manager myself, I will freely admit that hiring managers use certifications as discrimination tools to pick one candidate over another. That's not to justify it. That's to say plainly that that's what the real world has. However, certifications are very different from college degrees in at least one respect. A college degree, and this is how hiring managers also look at it, it's a basic qualification. It's like, do you have a social security number? Do you have a driver's license? If you have a college degree, it shows that you're intelligent, you're committed, and that you can carry something through to a completion. What it also makes very clear by the absence is that you have no experience. As you saw in the beginning of this webinar, the CISSP, like all of these certifications, it requires a clear delineation of experience. It may just be 5 years. It may be some other certification, which itself will have an experience requirement attached to it. To make a long story short, the certification that requires an experience quotient to be achieved is something that a college degree doesn't have. This shows that you can do something. If I'm in a hiring position, I look at candidates, I'll see their experience, I'll see their certifications. Having been in this business a long time and having taught many of these certification classes myself, I know what the candidates have. So to use myself as an example, this tells me what you know, or at least that you have the basics of it, whereas a college degree tells me that you're capable, but it doesn't tell me that you know in the real world what something may do or how it may look or how it may approach you. This certification tells me that, how you've encountered it, what you've done. So to the people who poo-poo certifications, I can't argue with them. It is a piece of paper. But because of what it symbolizes, what it requires of you to get it, it has definite value. And for better or for worse, hiring managers do look for it. I've been through many job postings to see, and getting ready for this webinar, to see what these job postings are asking for. Every single one in the cybersecurity area asks for, more often than not, this one particular one. It's been around almost longer than any other one, and it's the one that seems to be the gatekeeper. If you've got this, they at least know that you've achieved a minimum set of things.
Well, you certainly answered that question. It's definitely valuable and definitely worth it.
Well, let me add something to that.
Sure, go ahead.
This certification, this course, the exam, this represents a very substantial monetary and career investment. The candidates who want to take the class, who want to get the certification, they have to understand and realize that it has serious value. I will tell you very plainly, a lot of the opportunities that have come my way over my career, which as you said is many years, I seriously do attribute to the fact that I have a certification. It opens doors. It does. It's a considerable investment, and people have to understand that it really does return the value. I certainly believe, and I feel I am an example of that.
Excellent. Thank you, Ross. Thank you for your insight. It's definitely valuable to our listeners for sure, and to myself. So now we've covered all those 8 domains. Thank you again, Ross, for running through those. I just want to highlight to everyone listening that we have started creating a learning path here at Cloud Academy that will cover each of those domains and help you prepare so you're ready to be in a position to pass the CISSP. Currently, we have domain 1, 2, and 3 live and published on our site. And you'll all be pleased to know that Ross, who we have on the call today, has been the author of these courses. And I've been through them myself, and they are incredible courses. They go into great detail and cover all the points that's required. The domains 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 have all been recorded by Ross, and we just have our production team processing those at the minute. So in the coming weeks, you'll see the remainders of those domains appearing within this learning path. So if you are looking to take the certification, then you can follow Ross's learning path and be well on your way to becoming certified. So we're coming towards the end of our webinar now, and we should have time for a few questions. So let me just take a look and see what questions have been coming in. Okay, so let me start with this question. Ross, does the CISSP expire at all?
In one sense, it does. There is a continuing professional education credit requirement. You have to get 120 credits over a period of 3 years. ISC squared likes it if you get 40 per year. And if you don't get that, then your certification could expire. I have had some students in the past tell me that they let their thing expire every 3 years. That's its base certification period, and they retake the test every 3 years. Personally, I think that that's personal torture. If you keep your annual maintenance fees paid, if you keep your continuing professional education credits current, it will never expire. But you must do those things to prevent that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We have a few more questions here. Does each domain have a scale in terms of its percentage in the actual exam?
Actually, that's a very good question, and the answer is yes. There is a guide that I recommend all candidates go to the isc2.org website and download. It's called The Ultimate Guide. It will tell you within approximately what range each domain percentage will be represented on the test. Now, that will vary from one test to another, but this test has to be normalized across all the test takers during a particular given period of time. So they're not concrete numbers, they're approximations, but it won't be more than a couple of fractions off. So that is there for you to see. And it represents what, over the course of time, professionals like all those attending, me, people like yourself, Stuart, have said over the years takes up that much percentage of their working life. So it represents what the working professionals have told ISC Squared it takes up.
Excellent, thank you. Now, here's a question that I kind of fall into the same kind of realm as well when I've done previous certifications. The question is, how long would you recommend preparing for the exam? And is there such a thing of overstudying to the point that you get overwhelmed? I mean, I know I've done that in the past with previous certifications, and it's just finding that borderline of how far to go.
Actually, that's a very good question, and it does pose a particular pain point for students. Someone who is very strong in a particular area, they may be drawn to that because they're comfortable with it at the expense of the other areas. The bar that I used to use was when you take practice exams, and there are some very good practice exam resources out there, and I do recommend that candidates explore those. When you get to the point of taking your practice exams and you score better than 70% routinely across the domains, I would say that you're ready, however long it takes you to get to that point. Some people have told me that they have studied for several months. Some people have told me that they have studied for maybe 6 weeks. The fact is, some people are just good test takers, but that's leaving things to chance, and I don't recommend that. What I recommend is this. Over the years, I've told candidates in class that taking the exam within 4 to 8 weeks of their completion of the course seems to be about the best level because it makes certain that they set a definite deadline, meaning that they have something to work towards with a definite end rather than just leaving it open. But it gives them a chance to study in depth each domain. They need to study the domain, take the practice questions, and see how they do as their checkpoint to see how they're doing. But that seems to be a very good one. If you've got the minimum number of years experience, that seems to work rather well. My own case, I didn't have any of these materials when I was doing it. I had 22 years to study, and a 41-page CBK, which is not like the wealth of resources they have today. I was still very nervous about mine, even with all of that. So, but that's what has worked well for my students over the course of time.
Excellent, thank you. I think that's a key point as well, is to set yourself a target date rather than leaving it open-ended, because you find yourself just going on and you get a little bit lapse with it, and then you have to restudy that area. Whereas if you've got a set date for your exam, you're on a set time frame, you know what areas you have to study by when. So I think that's a really good point.
No, it is. Now, one quick anecdote. You made the comment that they get overwhelmed or they overstudy. That is very definitely a risk, A student of mine who works with encryption was very unfamiliar with public key, though she knew everything else. She studied and studied and studied and sent me an email before she took her exam to tell me that I finally got it. I understand. She took her test 2 weeks later, sent me an email, said she failed, which puzzled me because she was an excellent student and grasped it all. And in talking with her, I found out one thing, and I bring this up because this is a risk for candidates, especially if they're more inclined towards the technical. You can overdo it. She overdid it. She got to the point where she understood. She went back and hit it again. And she got herself reconfused, as she herself said. So, an object lesson for everyone on this webinar. You can overdo it. Be very careful. Don't get yourself to the point where you've done that, whether it's because you focus too much on one domain and not enough on others, or you've gotten too deep into a single domain. It's a balance. You need to balance your time across them all.
It's certainly a difficult one and a tough one to balance, but finding it is key. Okay,
yes,
we have time just for another couple of questions. We have one here. Is the CISSP the highest certification offered by ISU², or are there any other certifications that need to be cleared even before applying for the CISSP?
Actually, there's one that you could use as a junior version. They have the System Security Certified Practitioner, which, now this is me talking, I consider it to be more of a practical kind of a certification, but it serves as a good lead-in to the CISSP because the CISSP basically caps what the SSCP, as it's known, talks about at a more nut and bolt type of a level. But there's no precursor certification that you need to have to take the CISSP.
Okay, excellent. I think you just kind of answered another question here as well. The question is, as a technical InfoSec admin with 3 years experience, would it be beneficial to go for the SSCP as it's more technical minded, or just proceed with the CISSP? So I think that kind of covers what you just said as well.
Well, let me add one point. It depends, in my mind, to that candidate, I would say it depends on what you have in front of you in the way of a career path. If you're going to stay technical, working, as I put it, flying consoles, working with the nut and bolt and being intimate with hardware and software, the SSCP might be the better case. But if you want to grow and evolve in security, getting a CISSP, I would consider all but absolutely necessary. And at 3 years, you would get your CISSP as the associate and then work your other 2 years until it actually got awarded. So looking ahead of what's in front of you, that would be more of an indicator of which one you want to go for.
Excellent, great advice, thank you. Okay, one last question just before we wrap up. How much reading between the lines should you expect to have to do on the test questions? I think that's quite a good question.
That is a question that candidates are always worried about. To explain that, the questions are written by people very much like those attending this webinar today, people like me. They're working professionals. They write the questions, and it goes through a multi-stage vetting process. Not everybody has a talent for that, so they have to be vetted by peer review. Questions that require you to read in are typically eliminated because answering that one is based on interpretation, and that's not what this test is about. I would say in general, what works the best is to read the question very carefully, of course, to make sure you understand exactly what's being asked of you, and to take the question at face value. This vetting process eliminates, and forgive me for being somewhat colorful, it eliminates stupid, poorly worded, confusing questions so that the question quality, in my estimation, remains very high. There should be very little reading in you should have to do. But on the heels of that, let me say this. The answer that you choose must answer every part of the question being asked, making understanding the question extremely important. The only answer that is right, and many of the false answers, many of the answers that you're going to come across are themselves going to be true statements. But if they don't answer the actual question being asked of you, just because they're true doesn't make them correct. So always be wary of that. But there shouldn't be much reading between the lines that any candidate should have to do.
That's good to know. Thank you very much, Ross, for giving us that insight there. So I think we've pretty much come to the end. Just one point I want to make. Obviously, security and cybersecurity and all the content within the CISSP can be quite a dry topic. But as I understand it, Ross, would you say it's fair to say that the rewards come afterwards once you've achieved the certification?
I would say absolutely yes. As I said before, I attribute a lot of the opportunities I've had come my way to the fact that I have this. Is it the be all and end all? No. There are many very high quality certifications out there. But something that shouldn't surprise anybody, doing well on this one probably means that you have a good understanding of the concepts that will be embodied in other ones. So do I think the rewards are there? Absolutely, I do.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar today. It's been great going through this topic, and a special thanks to yourself, Ross, and your knowledge. You have a wealth of knowledge and so much to speak about with this topic, and it's been a privilege discussing this topic with you today. So thank you very much.
It's been a real pleasure for me too. Thank you.
And that's it. Thanks again. And please look out for our future webinars at cloudacademy.com/webinars. Thank you very much. Bye.